Are the Beatles bigger than Glenn Miller? Well, at this point in time, the irrational seems to be taking place within our market. In 1939 and 1940, before World War II really had an effect on America, before the paper drives took their toll, and at a point in time when popular culture really wasn't defined in the United States, it certainly wasn't revered or collected, the probability of action number one being put away and kept in perfect condition and then surviving for the next 2 or 3 or 4 decades was very slim. So why should Amazing Fantasy 15 from the current era, from the 60s, from the Silver Age of comics, start becoming worth so much money? This copy is a pedigree copy, the White Mountain copy of Amazing Fantasy 15. It's probably going to be the most feverishly bid upon comic in the third Sotheby's auction. And the reason for that, why would people be more interested in this comic book than Action number 1 or Marvel number 1, the payout copies? Part of it is perception of movement. People probably feel that eventually these comics have a great deal of growth potential in front of them in the next few years. But who would have dreamed that we would be talking about a range of between $17,000 and $25,000 as a real possibility for this Silver Age comic? Just 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, no one was expecting $10,000 for any Silver Age comic unless maybe it was a pristine mint Showcase 4. What seems to be happening right now, and it's also echoed by what's taking place on the auction floor with artwork, by the fact that we have a last-minute entry of John Romita's cover to Spider-Man number 40. This would be the second Romita cover in that series. It's not even a Steve Ditko cover. The estimate is $5,500 to $7,500. We think this cover is going to crack $10,000. On the other hand, we have an Alex Raymond from 1937 estimated at $7,000 to $10,000, and in the past people would expect it to sell for $20,000. There will be more heat, there'll be more interest in the Romita cover. I think that sort of defines the fact that the Silver Age is still just white hot at this point in the market. And the baby boomers seem to be outspending their parents at the moment on rare comics. Okay, we'll break again. People have asked me several times, how did you come to be the consultant at an auction house with such a reputation like Sotheby's, or why has Sotheby's chosen at this point in time to begin auction comic books? Why have they had auctions for comic books? Now, why now? Part of the answer to that is that I had evolved myself to a point where I didn't want to do retail. I had a bookstore in Harvard Square in Boston, and I was beginning to want to do something different. And the point in evolution was just right. Popular culture in the United States now is heavily collected, and I came into New York and realized that there were actually departments that existed at Christie's and Sotheby's that were collectibles departments. Animation really began to define this whole collectible area, and there was a very, very defined market for animation. Just before I proposed the first comic art auction, Bruce Hershenson had a very successful auction of rare posters at Christie's, something that was supposed to be a chancy area for them was a $1 million, 100% sellout success. So we decided to attempt the first comic art auction. It's really difficult to build a $1 million auction when you're dealing with the increments of comic books. You've got to have a combination of high-end property where you have $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 pieces, and then the low end and the middle range. But the idea of doing it was very intriguing to me because I had published different books, and I was very, very interested in the artists. And I think that my interest in the art has been a primary vehicle for developing this auction, because as it turns out, there's quite a balance between original art and comics, and there's a growing interest in the collectors community in collecting and owning the originals. As people mature and begin to learn these comics, they find out that there were very special people who wrote and drew and illustrated the comics. They become more interested in those individuals' careers, and they go after the artwork. The fact that these auction houses have now stepped into this market, I think, is just an indication of where we are in an evolutionary phase. The market is big enough to sustain this kind of traffic. It's also big enough to where the conventions serve a certain purpose, and the dealers all over the United States who have worked so diligently in the last 2 or 3 decades to build their clientele and unearth the rare comics, that market is all still there. It's growing, it's very stable. But there's now room for developing these auctions and working with different estates. It turns out Sotheby's, for some reason, has that magical capability to unearth the impossible. Just this last Saturday, when we opened the exhibit floor, we signed on contract the original art to 2 comic book covers that none of the experts knew existed. The cover to World's Finest number 5, that's the earliest known World's Finest cover, and the cover to Action Comics number 50, where Superman's down in the miner's cave holding up 2 beams. That's probably the most exciting part of what I do, is that discovery. And I think that it's the element where both Christie's and Sotheby's are contributing to our market. People are more apt to come to these auction houses with this artwork. The auction houses penetrate the media in a way that comic book conventions or the news of a sale of Action 1 for $50,000 didn't do before. Because they're constantly penetrating the media, and because it's a 24-hour situation where their consultants and everyone are available, we seem to be unearthing a whole new generation of discoveries for the comic book collecting community. Let's cut for